Urban America. So far, we've been focusing on rural America. Now let's turn to urban America. Being fairly loose with chronology, looking at the end of the 1880s and the early 1900s, I want to be thematic for a while and talk about the long-term trends rather than lots of specific dates. In discussing urban America, let's first think about some things like industrialization, immigration, and urbanization. First of all, industrialization. Part of the story is technological, okay? What made industrialization possible? Now, I'm talking about a period of rapid industrialization in America. It's the technology or the processes, such as the Bessemer process in producing steel, various inventions, and the use of the assembly line. Also, keep in mind the law of supply and demand. With an increasing demand for industrialization to produce more goods, this fueled industrialization. Another part of the story is the entrepreneurs themselves, the big men like Rockefeller, Carnegie, and J.P. Morgan. Sometimes these men were referred to as robber barons, that they were taking advantage of those less fortunate in order to build up their empires. On the other hand, they've also been looked at with admiration for their skill in practicing business. How did the big men get so big? Well, they made use of the principle of monopoly. Okay, most of you have probably played the Monopoly board game, and you know that the way to win is to buy up as much of your competition as possible. There are a couple different ways of doing this. First of all, there's horizontal integration, which Rockefeller used. With horizontal integration, you want to buy up as much as you can of your industry. For example, buying up all the oil companies so that you're not in competition with other oil companies. Then there's vertical integration, which Carnegie practiced. Instead of simply buying up all of one level of an industry, Carnegie wanted to control every aspect of the steel industry. This was both good and bad. Certainly, it was good for business leaders like Rockefeller and Carnegie to build up empires for themselves. It also allowed them to operate efficiently and make more at cheaper prices, which was good for consumers. But it wasn't so good for smaller businesses who were trying to compete with them. The bigger the monopoly, the more difficult it was to compete. Some restrictions against these monopolies and trusts were enacted, like the Sherman Antitrust Act, but they weren't well enforced. What about the little man in industrial America? On the one hand, industrialization meant more job opportunities, but it also meant that workers were seen almost as replaceable parts. Skilled laborers of the past were not as valued as before because it didn't require a lot of skill to have an industrial job. It also meant that they would be dependent on their employer for their wages. There wasn't much in the way of job security. If you were hurt on the job or if anything happened, then you could easily be replaced with someone else. That leads us to the matter of immigration. There was a large wave of immigrants coming to America in this period, drawn by the opportunity to find work. First of all, let's consider this new immigration. Why were they considered new immigrants? They were coming from different parts of Europe than before. Before this time, most immigrants had come from northwestern Europe, and now more were coming from southeastern Europe. Their cultures were different, their languages, their religions, the food they ate, and the clothes they wore were much different from many of the immigrant groups of the past. They were coming because of both push and pull factors, the things they wanted to leave behind in their old lives and the opportunities that were drawing them to America. For all its limitations, America promised relative freedom and opportunity. Things wouldn't be perfect when they got to America, but compared to the lives that they were leaving behind, this was the land of freedom and opportunity. Freedom from oppression and opportunity to get out of poverty. As you might imagine, Americans looked at these immigrants in different ways. Some Americans were nativists. They responded to the immigrants with the nativist philosophy, the philosophy that we were here first and we don't welcome the competition that you are bringing for our jobs. We don't welcome your cultural differences. Nativists preferred that the immigrants stayed where they came from. But not all Americans had such a hostile attitude. Consider the settlement house movement. Jane Addams established the Hull House in Chicago in order to provide a safe haven for the immigrants to come, get help, get an education, and learn to read and write in English. She was there to help. The settlement house movement took this idea to different cities. When we think about urbanization, these large cities springing up across America, we need to first think about the working and living conditions that were there. Job safety, non existent. Job security, non existent. Sanitation was a problem in both the workplace and in homes. There were fire hazards. There were no building codes to protect against the dangers of fire. Many of these industrial families were living in crowded, dirty tenements, very overcrowded tenements. Jacob Riis was instrumental in exposing how the other half lived through photography and writing. He wanted to expose the rest of America to what was going on within these cities. Another part of urbanization in this city environment was political corruption. Political machines like Tammany Hall exploited the needs of immigrants in the American cities for political purposes. Just imagine that you're an immigrant that's just arrived in America. You don't speak the language. You don't know many people around you. You're in a big city like New York, and you have no idea where to begin, where to turn to look for a job or home. Maybe you're coming from Ireland. An Irishman meets you soon after your arrival. You recognize his accent, and he asks where you're from. You tell him, and he says, "Oh, I have family there. It's so nice to meet you. Do you have a place to stay? Do you have a job?" Of course you don't yet. He offers to help you, and he does help you get set up. Is he just being nice? Maybe. But he may very well be working for a political machine. He's doing favors for you, expecting favors in return. Let's say Thanksgiving comes. You don't have enough money to buy a Thanksgiving turkey. He shows up at your door. "Guess what? I brought a turkey for your family to celebrate Thanksgiving." What a good friend. Actually, he expects political favors. He expects you to vote for the political machine that he works for. George Washington Plunkett was part of a political machine. He wrote in defense of this system, claiming that it helped people and wasn't really hurting anybody. Sure, he was helping himself. In his words, he'd seen his opportunities and he took them. He was using political advantage for himself, but he also said that he was helping other people. However, reformers like Lincoln Steffens argued that political corruption was not a good thing, and yes, it was hurting people. When these machines got power through political corruption, they weren't held accountable for how they did their job. Okay? They weren't doing much to address the problems of the cities: sanitation, fire safety, the tenements, sewage systems, and so on. They didn't have to address the problems because they were so secure in their power based on political corruption. Of course, city life wasn't all bad. Some of the same things that drew people to American cities today did at that time too. A sense of community. Many of these immigrants clustered together in immigrant communities where they retained much of their culture. They participated in sports like baseball, for example. Obviously, communication was easier in a city than in rural America. Finally, I want you to think about a movie that you may have seen as a child, An American Tail, the story of Fievel the Mouse and his family. This animated film from the 80s does a good job for an animated film of bringing together some of these historical things. Why does Fievel's family decide to leave Russia? Well, the cats played the bad guys just as the mice played the good guys. They're terrorized by the cats. They sing that little song that there are no cats in America and the streets are paved with cheese. There are no cats in America and a mouse can be at ease. So they come to America expecting everything to be different, the land of freedom and opportunity. Of course, Fievel gets separated from his family, and when he arrives in America needing help and not knowing where to turn, guess who meets him there? Honest John. Of course, he's disguised as a mouse, but he turns out to be a cat. Yes, there are cats in America. There is exploitation. There is oppression. I'm not going to give the whole story away for you, but many of these elements are there. the corrupt political machine bosses, and exploitation, the mice learn to come together, and although there are cats in America, they learn that they can work together to make their new home better. Finally, I want to consider some different ideologies pertaining to the problems of industrial America. Remember the question that I brought up when we talked about the populists? When you're facing a problem and trying to decide how to respond, you can either rationalize, reform, or reject the current system. Okay? As I go through these different ideologies or ideas about how to respond to the world around them and its problems, I want you to think about how they fit into this spectrum from rationalize to reject, with reform in the center. First of all, there's social Darwinism. Okay, social Darwinism. Darwinism, of course, refers to the biological theory of evolution from Charles Darwin. But Herbert Spencer was a sociologist who took the basic idea of survival of the fittest and applied it to getting ahead in society. Basically, social Darwinism taught that those who made it in the world, those who were able to make money, make a name for themselves, were the fit who deserved it. Those who were stuck in poverty didn't deserve it. This definitely falls under the rationalized end, recognizing that there are wide gaps between rich and poor, but accepting that this is natural and good. Another ideology is that of rags to respectability. If you study novels by Horatio Alger during the 1800s, you'll see that this is a common theme. He wrote about young boys who were born in poverty and who were able to rise not necessarily from rags to riches like Carnegie did, but at least up to respectability. One of the most famous novels is Ragged Dick. It's about a bootblack named Dick who did just this. With his rags to respectability philosophy, it resembled social Darwinism because these boys had certain traits that helped them get ahead. No matter where they started out in life, through hard work, honesty, morality, or discipline, they were able to get ahead. But there was also another important element in these stories that separated it from social Darwinism. That's the theme of help from others. Each of these boys, no matter how hard they tried, stories didn't change until some nice stranger intervened and offered them the little help that they needed to make all of the difference. Then there's the ideology of the gospel of wealth, popularized by Andrew Carnegie. According to the gospel of wealth, there are rich and there are poor, and some are more fit than others, but with wealth comes responsibility. Carnegie believed that he was responsible for using his wealth to improve those who were less fortunate in society. His way of doing that was through philanthropy. Carnegie gave a lot of money for libraries, for example. Not a handout, but a chance to help someone less fortunate rise above his situation. If you think about it, everything would be fine if all the Carnegies in the world followed the gospel of wealth consistently, if they treated their workers fairly and used their wealth responsibly. But in this imperfect world, we know that all the Carnegies don't follow the gospel of wealth. First, let me give you an example of someone who did use his position responsibly and things did work out well. Henry Ford. I'm sure you've heard of him. Ford of the Ford automobile industry. Henry Ford was certainly a successful capitalist. He built a huge empire and he did well for himself, but he also helped those who worked for him. Ford was famous for paying his workers a $5 day at a time when he could have easily paid them much less. Everybody else was paying less. At first glance, it might have looked like Ford was out of his mind, like he would go bankrupt in a year. He was throwing all his money away, paying his workers way too well. But what did Ford know that many didn't? For one thing, by taking good care of his employees, he was inspiring loyalty. They were working hard, doing their best, and turning out a good product. All of this money that he was paying them made them able to save up and reinvest in the company. What were they doing with that money? They were buying Ford automobiles, so it was a win-win situation. But as we know, they aren't all Henry Fords. This is where another ideology comes in, the labor unions. If all the bosses in the world were like Henry Ford, maybe labor unions never would have taken off. The Knights of Labor and the American Federation of Labor are examples of major labor unions. You can read about some important strikes during this period, so the labor unions leaned even farther away from the rationalized end of the spectrum. Finally, getting to the rejection end of the spectrum is socialism, the socialist critique. Socialists like Eugene Debs believed that it wasn't enough just to reform the system, to abide by certain rules, to make certain changes and make things work better. He thought that capitalism was the problem itself and that it should be rejected and exchanged for socialism. What's the difference between socialism and capitalism? Well, Mike Huckabee has a funny way of putting it. He says that socialism is where you have two cows and the government takes one of the cows and gives it to your neighbor. Capitalism, you have two cows, you sell one, and you buy a bull. Okay, that's a funny definition. Basically, socialists advocated making changes in order to redistribute wealth more evenly, to shrink the gap between rich and poor. This attracted some followers. As you might imagine, some of those who were lower on the ladder saw this as an opportunity to benefit. Those at the top saw it as a threat. For example, what if we were to make this class a socialist experiment? All of you do your work, turn in your assignments, get your grades, and do your very best. At the end of the semester, I'll average everyone's work and give everyone the same grade. Does that sound fair? Some of you might like that idea if you weren't planning on doing your best, or maybe you try really hard and struggle with history. That might help you. But on the other hand, some of you are probably used to being straight A students. You don't like the idea of working to bring someone else's grade up. Under this system, you might not do your best work. This illustration kind of gets at the heart of the debate of socialism versus capitalism. In the lecture, we'll talk about the progressive movement and how progressive reformers emphasized this middle path of reform, recognizing that something had to change, and if there was no change, they might be risking complete upheaval.